Big Salty. It was mid-afternoon and steaming hot when Darcy and I left the camp in the little dinghy, paddling because Darcy said we were better off doing a short section of the river properly than roaring along for miles in the big boat with the outboard motor, picking up the odd easy ones and disturbing everything else. You can quite often get up to an old croc with an outboard motor, he said. But you must be careful not to change the speed of it, keep it at a steady sound, and blind him with the light so he doesn't know how close you are coming. This theory is very good, only I am not certain that the light does not blind a croc. It doesn't stop them from swimming away in any direction if they want to, and it doesn't seem to make any difference how dull or bright the light is, so long as it lights up their eyes. It could be that it hypnotizes the croc when he is in some moods. I know this, though. I've lost many crocodiles using an outboard motor on my boat that I would have got if I'd been using my paddle. Too many disturbing noises, stopping and starting the motor or putting it in and out of gear, the big space you need to maneuver the boat in, driving the shooter into the branches overhanging the banks because you can't stop in time, hitting logs under the water with the propeller, the smoke and the fumes drifting ahead of you blinding your light, disturbing crocs you can't see further on. I can stop my little dinghy and turn it right round with one sweep of the paddle. He could too. I don't have to carry fuel and spare parts or learn how to fix a motor, and I can work on my own when I have no mate with me. The only real advantage of using an outboard motor is that it's easier and quicker. In the end, it is only a matter of time it takes to cover a river. I have plenty of time. I will get my crocodiles. So we paddled up the river in the little dinghy, and it was very pleasant. The gentle coo-cooing of pigeons in the overhanging tea trees, hushing of air through she-oaks, and rifle fish like spotted patches of shade, splashing along the reeds. Leaves and debris on the smooth water revolving slowly upstream on a filling tide. The dinghy slid along, in and out of the shade, along one bank under Darcy's lazy, easy paddling. The rising water gurgled loudly into holes in the mud at the banks, and around the second bend we met the coming and going stank of something dead. A crocodile had hidden somewhere. "Smell that?" I whispered. He nodded. "Croc." He nodded again. "Do you think there's something dead around here?" Darcy laid the paddle across the bow of the dinghy and began to roll one of his rare smokes. "I have never seen where a croc has buried anything he's killed," he said, "but if he'd made a good job of it, I would not have been able to. And they could not bury a cow or horse. Most of the things they kill are just left to be floating around till they're ready to eat. Wallabies and pigs are mostly dragged into the reeds, but anything that is left out in the current just floats up and down on the tides. You understand? It doesn't go far." We carried on, and an hour later Darcy pointed with his paddle to a big wet slide running down a sloping bank in an isolated patch of mangroves. "Slide," I whispered. "Big Salty." "Yes," said Darcy interestedly. "Big bloke." He paddled across and swept the dinghy close in to the bank, holding it there with the paddle stuck in the mud. About 12 or 14 feet. We might see him later. "How much farther are we going today, Darcy?" "We shall paddle until the tide turns, and then hunt crocs on the going out tide back to our camp. It is important to know how your tides are working because they can help you, or make it hard for you, whichever you shall prefer. You have to learn that in some places it is better to go after your croc when the tide is low, because when the water is high he can hide from your light under the branches of the trees that reach into the water. In other places you must wait until the water is rising so you can float across bars and logs. Always go up a strange river in the daylight so you know what your light is shining on when you return in the dark looking for crocodiles. An hour later the current on the river was still, and it was high tide. We found a little beach among reeds and put ashore. There was about an hour and a half to wait before it would be properly dark, and we lit a small fire to boil up the water we'd brought for a brew of tea. As soon as it becomes dark, we can begin searching for crocodiles, said Darcy. It is as good a time of the night as any other. How much further does this river go, Darcy? I remember it to fork a few miles further on. One branch is deep and narrow and runs back for many miles. It is very twisting, like all creeks that drain flat country. One moment the wind is behind you, and then it blows in your face. In 2 miles you are only a few hundred yards in a straight line from the mouth. The other branch is wide and shallow, and ends very soon in mangrove swamps and creeks and mud. There are crocodiles there, but they are hard to get to. The mosquitoes and sandflies would kill a man if he was left in there for one night without fire. We drank tea and talked, and soon it was nearly dark and time for us to go. I packed the tea billy and pannikins into their sack with the plastic water jar and fitted them under the seat in the stern of the dinghy. Then we checked the gear to be certain we'd brought everything: harpoon, quill, and rope, knife, headlight and battery, axe, smokes, crockbox, sacks folded on the seats for us and the rifles, baling tin, sack for the stuffers, ropes and mosquito repellent, and rifles. Everything's here. I sat in the stern of the dinghy. All right, let us start back. I'm hoping for 2 crocodiles. We shall see. He pushed us away from the bank and sat in the bow. Out in the stream he adjusted his light on his forehead and carefully lined it up with the 303 on a floating leaf. The boat began to slide along the river under the big silent strides of Darcy's paddle, the spotlight searching the river for the red eyes of the big blokes. I noticed Darcy's routine with the light. When he came round a bend, he raked the light lightly over the whole stretch of water, and any crocs that were there would usually be lit up at once. Even if he did spot one, he would still give the rest of the place a good rake over, in case there were more crocs or a bigger one. Up and down along each bank several times, working forward with the progress of the dinghy. Half an hour later, the soundless dip and swirl of the paddle was interrupted as Darcy steered the dinghy towards a glimpse of red in some reeds on the bank ahead. Then suddenly he veered off towards the blazing, wide-apart eyes of Big Salty further down the river. Never mind the little one in the reeds now. Here's a real big bloke. Darcy paddled steadily down towards the glowing eyes at the end of the unwavering light, and I was sure that here was my first Big Salty. I could hear my own jerky breathing. Suddenly a garfish came flashing in to the boat and fell wriggling into the bailing tin. I nearly yelled with fright, and it was a second or two before I tipped the blasted thing over the side. The croc didn't move, and Darcy paddled on as though he hadn't heard the fish. Closer. The eyes vanish. Darcy stops paddling, but lets the dinghy drift on. The croc might come up again. There he is further on. Keep going. Deep water here, a harpoon job. Closer, pole in hand, paddle in the other, he gently gathers in the slack rope along the pole from the fixed quill to his handhold. The ridged snout and the thick neck just under the water behind the eyes. We're getting too close. Throw it, you fool. Now. Oh, got him. The croc vanishes in a thrashing churn of water, but the rope looping out over the bow of the rocking dinghy tells he's fixed on the quill. Darcy picks the dropped pole out of the water and puts it quietly back in the boat. He picks up the knife just in case. The rope stops feeding out. There's still a few coils left between Darcy's feet. He picks up the 303 and closes the bolt on a cartridge. A gentle tug on the slack rope to get his position. The rest of it runs out and the dinghy is jerked half round. Silence, the river is oil. Crabs crack and plop in the mangroves, and mud skippers flash silver like knife blades against the mud in the sweeping light. The dinghy swings slackly across the current. He's got to come up for air. Suddenly, red eyes out in the middle of the stream, the comfortable roar of the 303, and the great white belly floats in the light and begins to fade downstream into the water. Quick, drag him in before he sinks. Loop the rope round his jaws. He's still twitching. Pass me the axe. Chunk, chunk, behind the head. There, that's fixed him. Drag him across to the bank. Tie him to this tree with a piece of spare rope and cut out the harpoon quill. Mark the place, break branches, and leave them hanging. Remember that dead tree sticking out into the river. We shall come back and skin him tomorrow when the tide is out. About the same size as the other one we got, 14-footer. Skin should be worth about 30 quid if it's first grade. I didn't see any marks on it. We'll go back and have a look for that freshie we saw first when we had a smoke. How many more do you think will get Darcy? Darcy stopped coiling the stiff, wet harpoon rope and looked at me blindingly with the light on his forehead. If we don't get any more crocodiles tonight, we have still done very well. You can paddle all night in a river like this one and not see one. The first croc was still there. Darcy drifted the dinghy up to it, shot it with the .22, chopped it behind the head, and passed it back to me, a 5-foot freshie. We lit up another big bloke that went down and stayed there when we got to within 50 yards of him. Darcy switched off the light, and we drifted in the dark for what seemed half an hour. Suddenly the light went on again with a quick sweep and found the eyes, upstream 50 yards, 25 yards and down. He went again. Darcy drew the dinghy up to where the eyes went down, but he seemed to expect the croc to come up on the other side of the river. It did. Darcy shot him on the move and just managed to get the harpoon into him before he went out of sight, but Darcy fell into the river doing it. I nearly went after him, attempting an alarmed and clumsy rescue, and he had to tell me to get on the other side of the boat, so he could climb back in without tipping it up. We found the harpoon pole floating against the bank, and then Darcy gently drew in the croc, while I stood behind him with the 303. It was an 11-footer, dead as a doornail. Darcy re-killed it with the axe, and we laid it out in the dinghy. There was another big bloke further down, but Darcy didn't waste much time on him. The first glimpse of his eyes was the only one we got. The camp was in darkness when we got back, but those dogs made sure we didn't miss the place. Fifth got up to see what we'd got and put on a feed for us. It was 2 o'clock when we crawled into our swags, and 7 in the morning when Brushkovitz woke up barking at the 7-foot king brown snake, 15 yards from the camp. I blew its head off with the .222, and we got a photograph of Brushkovitz frowning disapprovingly at the dead coils beside the Land Rover. After a wallaby breakfast, we skinned the 2 crocs we'd brought in the night before. Then we all went up the river to skin the big bloke we'd left tied to the tree. It was afternoon by the time we had the 3 skins salted and rolled up in a sack. Then we prepared our gear and ourselves for a trip to the head of the river next day. We would camp near the forks Darcy had spoken of and work from there. We didn't go out shooting that night. Next morning we set up the Manara in the big 15-foot boat with the outboard motor towing the little dinghy behind because Darcy wouldn't hear of leaving it behind, and it was handy to carry the dogs in. They would have been a hell of a nuisance climbing wet all over our gear. Brushkovitz was very indignant about not being allowed to ride in the front of the boat with the people, and the dingo pup kept climbing out and having to be gone back for. On up the river past where we'd got the first big bloke, the bloated carcass of a big cattle beast floating high among some reeds. Must have been a big croc to drag that into the river and drown it. They are not all dragged down and drowned and floated out by the tides. Cattle can fall down banks and fail to find a place where they can climb out. You are not to be blaming the croc for every death in the river, but most of the time it is he. We saw 5 cattle and several wallabies floating in the river that day and smelt several other dead somethings. Round a bend we saw a great gray battleship of a croc slide smoothly into the water. Darcy said that he would have heard us coming from a long way back and waited to have a look at us. There was something contemptuous about the lazy way he sank into the water. We saw and smelt a horde of flying foxes hanging in the trees and wheeling thick and screeching the air at our passing. Wallabies ran, leaping from the shade and up over the banks, and we had to shout at the dogs and throw floating sticks at them. A black pig trotted along a sandbar with 4 little pigs and a tidy row behind it, and disappeared into a thick tangle of dead scrub, as though it had been rehearsed. The horrified scrawlings of white cockatoos in a tree leaning over the river. Beyond the forks we found a good camping place, near fresh water and distant from rotting animals. It was a strange place to me, and yet there was a familiar atmosphere about it. Must have been the missus being there. Some of my favorite memories are of things that happened during our stay in the headwaters of the lazy Monara. We got a hoary old 17-footer by the forks on the first night we went out from that camp. It took the 2 of us all day to do the hide. It was heavier than one man could lift. We harpooned a wallaby swimming in the river ahead of an 11-foot freshie. We wanted the wallaby for dog tucker, and Darcy could tell we were going to get the croc anyway. It was the biggest freshie he'd ever seen. Me too. The dogs we were looking after were a bigger nuisance than the sandflies and mosquitoes. They were always fighting, pinching something, getting in the way, vanishing or making a noise. They annoyed Prashkovitz as much as us. I'm afraid Fifth was their only friend. We shot an 8-foot salty on a log and harpooned a one-eyed rogue in a side creek. I've never been able to find out what exactly a rogue crocodile is. There are plenty of them around. It sounds good. We discovered a branch of the river that had never been shot before, because we had to hack a path for the dinghy through overhanging branches to get into it. But there's no reason why we should believe that the crocs in this creek have never been hunted, said Darcy. They move about from place to place, and most of them will have been out in the main river often enough to get chased by outboard motors and experts with big hats and quick rifles. That may well be why they are in this creek. Otherwise, the main river is a much better place for a crocodile to live. I was beginning to realize what I was seeing when Darcy leaned forward in the dinghy with a croc lit up in the spotlight. His attention was fixed not so much on what he could see, but what he knew was there, not interested in what the croc was doing, but what it was likely to do. If it stayed where it was as good as dead. When he goes down in a creek, watch for him to come up on the opposite bank. In a big river, he will come up again out in the middle. If he keeps going down and coming up further along the river, he is heading for somewhere and won't let you come close to him until he is there and feels safe. These are not habits, just possibilities. Darcy dived in 8 feet of water for a dead croc. If he was only wounded, he would not be here still. I can feel him down there, but I can't get the rope round him. Pass me the harpoon. I shall dive down and stab it into him, and we shall try to raise him with it. It worked. I was learning how to paddle and sneak. One day I was paddling on my own up a creek with a can of water to hold the stern of the dinghy down, when I saw the head and shoulders of quite a big croc resting on the bank ahead. I drifted the dinghy back out of sight and beached it round the corner on the opposite bank from the one the croc was on. Then I began to stalk along the bank with my .222, well back from the river and creeping up to peer over the bank every 20 or 30 yards. He was still there, I moved along a few feet and rested the rifle ever so slowly through a clump of Mitchell grass. It was an easy shot, but to make absolutely sure, I took several sights through the scope before gently squeezing off a shot with the crossbar dead center on the back of the skull, where Darcy had shown me for this angle. The croc rolled half sideways and slid slowly back into the water. I ran back to the dinghy and paddled half a mile down to the camp to get the gaff, the skinning gear, and Fifth. Back at the scene of the kill, we were probing around in 10 feet of water where there was a hissing snort behind us. We turned in time to see the croc's head slide back under the water. He had come up for air, badly wounded, or he would have been gone from there altogether. But he was still alive. I picked up the rifle and we sat in the dinghy waiting for him to come up again. We sat there in the silence for what seemed an hour, and then the big head surfaced near the bank again. I started to raise the rifle, but Fifth yelled, "Look," and he went down again. We waited a while longer, with me whispering to Fifth to wait till I got her back to camp. Then she yelled, "Look," again, and pointed behind me. I clattered round in the dinghy, and there was the croc, crawling out on the bank to die. I shot him fair in the ear, and then again. 14 foot 6 and a first-grade skin. I was so pleased that I forgot to go crook at Fifth for yelling, "Look," till we were skinning the croc, and it was too late then. So I growled at her for leaving Darcy's good sharpening stone in the grass where it might get lost. She started slinging off about me being a big, fierce joker. It was high time she was put in her place again, much more cheek out of her, and I'd clip her one to show her who was head of the family. Darcy was very pleased with me getting the croc. It is better that you nearly lost him. You would have learned nothing if your bullet had killed him at first. That afternoon we put the net out across the river for barramundi, but most of the rubbish we caught were catfish, sawfish, and sharks right up in fresh water. The dogs had been lying around in the water and sniffing along the banks in the shade. We were eating under our mosquito nets to keep the flies away from our food, when suddenly there was a splash and half a scream from one of the dogs we were looking after. That was the last we saw or heard of him. We ran with rifles, but there was nothing to see or do about it, except hope we could get the croc that had taken him next time we were out shooting at night. We never did. We got no crocs near the camp at all, and none that evening looked as though it might have recently killed a dog. I went very crook at Fifth because we'd been swimming around there on the hot afternoons. It was a chilling experience. Fifth and I started going out on our own on nights when Darcy didn't feel like it. We got a few crocs, but the biggest of them was only 12 feet. We have already disturbed the big blokes round here. They will have moved away or be lying very quiet. I liked using the harpoon even when it wasn't strictly necessary. There was something exciting and kind of primitive about it, a thrill you never get from using a rifle. I always carried the harpoon in the dinghy, even in places where the water was so shallow and the creek so narrow that it was only a nuisance. Darcy once harpooned a croc and couldn't understand why it didn't come up for air or struggle when he pulled on the rope. When he hauled it in, he found he'd killed it stone dead. The quill had gone in between the vertebrae at the back of its neck and cut the spinal cord. In the afternoons, after crocs were skinned and food was eaten, we sometimes lay under our mosquito nets and had crocodile talks with Darcy. I was beginning to understand the man. For a long time I'd been unable to work out how a man as good at his job as Darcy could be so careless with his tools. His neglected gear lost him quite a few crocs. One day his .22 wouldn't go off. On the next, the bolt on the .303 would be glued with its own rust. The harpoon would be tangled and blunt. The spotlight would go out. It was frustrating and puzzling, till I began to realize that it was his informal way of farming the crocs in a river he was going to have to return to. A man like Darcy could do a river so thoroughly it would take the Crocs a long time to recover from a 100% attack. The condition of his gear was his quaint method of ensuring that there would be plenty of Crocs left for breeding for next time. I think that if crocodiles became so scarce that his way of living was threatened, Darcy would be most probably increase his advantage by upgrading his gear with a few drops of oil now and then, getting a roll of insulation tape for his light, and perhaps run the file over the edge of his harpoon quill occasionally. But it wasn't until much later, when we were going after a man-eater, that I saw what Darcy really could do when it was necessary. If a croc he really wanted could be got in any known way, he could apply the best method for the conditions as expertly as any man could do it. In spite of all he told us about the mystery of crocodiles, I sometimes got the feeling that I would never acquire his shadowy, unpronounceable understanding of them. It was the way he would go extra carefully at a place with nothing to distinguish it from hundreds of other places, and there'd be a croc there. "Did you get one in this place once before, Darcy?" "No," he would say, looking out across the river, "but I can smell them." But he didn't mean smell in the sense, or was I imagining things? Some rangers came and camped on the other side of the river, and Fifth paddled across and invited them over for a feed of protected pigeons, just to be sociable. They must have thought she was joking because they didn't accept her invitation, or maybe they were very unusual rangers. We dumped the stew, though, just in case. We were running out of salt, food, and new places to hunt. It was time to go back to our base camp down the river. We had a last feed of barramundi, loaded our stuff into the big boat, and the remaining 4 dogs into the little one, and arrived back at the bottom camp 3 weeks and 2 days after we'd left it. I was really beginning to be something of a croc shooter. Darcy and I went out twice to get some live crocs, 2 3-foot salties and an 18-inch freshie, for the bloke who'd lent us his boat. Darcy took the boat and motor down the river to Yaloginda, and Fifth and I drove round with all the gear. It was I who had to break the news to the bloke about his dog being taken by a croc. Of course it turned out to be his favorite dog, one of the best bred blue heelers in the Gulf. Crocs always select the best ones. He was quite pleased at getting the live crocs, though, and there was no animosity between us. Darcy and I drove out to collect the blitz from the camp and brought in our bags of skins to consign to the agent in Cairns. On the trip we'd got 264 feet of crocodile, according to Fifth's diary, a good 500 quid's worth, but we wouldn't be getting the check till we came back from the trip we'd planned to take round the Gulf to the Robinson River, or further if we had time before the wet season started, perhaps even to Arnhem Land. We left the dingo pup with the bloke. I'd bought him off because he was a bit small and sick to take on a 500-mile journey. Later, when we went back there, the black fellow wanted me to buy him again. If I paid £2 for him the first, he must be worth £3 now because he was bigger. We left him there. He was miserable in the Land Rover, and we had no use for him. Around the Gulf, there wasn't much times. We'd left it late in the year to decide on a trip to the rivers round the Gulf, and 6 weeks or 2 months was all we could expect to get in before the wet started. We were going to leave the Blitz in Yaloginda and try to carry everything in the Land Rover. 2 44-gallon drums, 1 for water and 1 for petrol, 7 bags of salt, 4 bags of flour, tobacco, and supplies, all the croc shooting gear, and the little dinghy lashed on the top. It was a big load. Out across the plain to the Gregory River crossing, then we followed an old defense road for endless miles of wandering wheel tracks, scattered bush, bull dust, and heat. Our backs sticking to the seats, and dust rising in gritty film through the holes in the cab floor. Darcy drives, I drive, nothing changing but the gears in deep dry swamps of bull dust. We camp, drive on past the Dumidigi mission sign saying, "Don't stop." What are they so unhospitable for, Darcy? The lubras sometimes run away and come to your camp if you are close by. The missions are doing great work, and half-caste children are not a help to them. Drive on, a fence, a thick waterhole, a buffalo that runs ahead through the trees and dives sideways out of sight. Aren't buffaloes supposed to be dangerous and charge on sight, Darcy? A buffalo is like most animals. It will run before it will fight. If you wound him or annoy him or frighten him, he will turn on you. He is very strong, and his anger is great. A herd of wild donkeys surges in a gray wave of long ears and rumps across the road ahead and vanishes in its own cloud of dust among the trees. Camp again, fuel up, and drive on. Shoot a big plain turkey, beautiful meat. Talk to an old man in a cool house by the road. He is caretaking for someone, perhaps God, who has forgotten to come back and relieve him. He has a garden of real green vegetables and is a close friend of the musical butcher bird and a bitter enemy of the black crow. Drive on to Westmoreland Station and pull up at a house of stones beside a fence of stones and a world of scattered stones. The countryside is changing. This is what a road would look like if we were the size of insects. Bershkovitz, a dusty host, falls weakly from the back in a shower of dust to drink noisily and endlessly at the lagoon of weeds. A sad dying pool of dirty water crowded with small fish and a black racecourse of dry mud plowed rough by many feet. It's been a long hot season. We are pale and coarse with dust, and our hair is brittle as wire. Up to our knees in mud, our waist in water, awash in water as hot as a shower, then a feed of salt, beef, and potatoes cooked by a gen at least 200 years old. The young station manager at Westmoreland was the only white person on the place. He was putting the finishing touches to a .303 pistol he'd cut down from an old army rifle. You often have to shoot the wild bulls in order to muster the other cattle, and galloping on a horse with a heavy rifle is an awkward business. The barrel had been hacksawed off about 5 inches beyond the breech, and he was taping a pistol grip onto the body of the thing. It was a dangerous-looking weapon. We were invited to witness the testing of it. The test pilot was summoned by a yell, passed from one group of blacks to the other till he was located, and came shuffling up to where we were standing, around being dubious and trying not to show it. He was apparently the most useful man on the place. Any horse that might buck was given to him to ride first. Any cattle that looked dangerous were tested with him. He risked his life many times a year for a couple of plugs of nicky tobacco a week and his tucker, and tucker for all his family, relatives and friends who might call in on a walkabout. Come here, see this rifle. That one pickaninny rifle, boss. It's loaded and cocked, so don't touch the trigger. Till you're ready to shoot 'em. Take 'em down there and kill 'em that feller tree. Don't point it at anyone. We got behind things while the black fellow carried the weapon halfway down to the lagoon as though it was a sleeping taipan. There's over 20 tons of pressure in a 303 bullet when it detonates. The makers never intended them to be discharged in this manner, I'm sure. He pointed the wavering pistol at the general direction of the tree he'd been told to kill. With his arm extended and his face turned away as though from a disgusting sight, then he fired it. Nobody could tell where the bullet went, but the black fellow and the pistol went in opposite directions. It was as though he'd pulled the trigger some time after he'd leapt away from it. The boss told him off for dropping the thing in the dirt. Then, seeing as how it hadn't blown up, he tried it himself. It nearly leapt out of his hand, and the bullet kicked up a faint geyser of dust away out to one side. We were all invited to have a go with the fabulous 303 pistol, and we all declined. It was an ugly and cumbersome-looking piece of work. By the time we left, the 2 hours, about 30 hair-raising explosions later, the boss had reached the stage where he could hit a 4'6" tree trunk at 6 feet by holding the thing tightly in both hands. There was little likelihood of the project becoming a raging success for anything but terrifying the blacks, who were by now standing away in tight apprehensive groups. Drive on, country the same as the plains, only rolling, with rocky ridges hunched between gullies where water had been flowing a long dry time ago. Growth in the gullies a little greener, but most of it the same dusty brown-green of 100 miles back, and hundreds of miles beyond that. Past Wollongong, right on the Queensland Northern Territory border. Fifth says we are now best professional croc shooters in Queensland and the Northern Territory. Turn off on a scoured bouldery track that was once a road and creep in low reduction 2 miles to a copper mine Darcy knows about. There's just time before dark to look around. The big blue hole and heaps of ore. The grave of the prospector who lived there for years, mining a few bags of rich copper when he needed food or gear. The cave he lived in up on the bluff. Everything left exactly as when he was there a year before, except the bulging brown coils of a 12-foot rock python piled on the bunk hanging on wire from the roof. Fresh, clear water up in the rocks. Camp on snapping leaves under the big mango tree on the flat. Decide not to pinch the handy little camp oven from the cave. And take off next morning through the rocks and dust for Calvert Hill Station, a glittering aluminum homestead in a sea of dirt and rocks. Friendly people, tidy, well-dressed black girls, boss away due back. Hundreds of goats, 6 clean white Brahmin bulls, flicking their long ears at flies by the waterhole. Imported to cross with the Hereford because they're quieter, less attractive to ticks, keep together, fight off dingoes, and don't mind the hot, waterless conditions. A handful of rope for relief. From the constant setbacks of disease, dingoes, and water. Too much and too little. Tie Prashkovitz to the Land Rover and stay the night. Fifth and I are woken by dogs barking and shouts down by the blacks' camp in the early hours. Darcy comes panting stealthily up the outside stairs and curls up in his swag on the floor. Lonely poor bastard. On to Robinson River Station next day with full bellies and fresh beef. They give us beef because they know we shall take a whole cow to salt down if they don't. Darcy's in a bad mood this morning. Shoot a roo for Prashkovitz and give half of it to the boss at Robinson River for his dogs. Get directions and travel downstream to a long deep lagoon in the riverbed. Crocs again at last. What a trip. 48 freshies in the mile-long lagoon the first night and 32 the second. They were thick, skinning and scraping, daylight to dark. Move on down towards the sea and one walking ahead, scouting a patch for the crawling Land Rover. All the time shooting crocs, moving on again, and shooting more crocs. Shooting crocs at waterholes, lagoons, and riverbanks. Fifth up to her knees in the water with rifle fish darting round her legs for floating fragments of scraped croc meat. Darcy taught us how to get a cool drink of water from a lagoon that is uncomfortably warm even to sit in. You take a pannikin and swim out to the deep water, then dive. Holding the empty mug carefully upside down, swim down to the cool water near the bottom of the lagoon and turn the pannikin up the right way. The air will bubble out, cool water will bubble in, and you swim to the surface with your cool drink. I often wonder now why we didn't worry about crocodiles when we were doing all this swimming, but with Darcy there we didn't think of them. Perhaps he knew. In some places he would say, "We shall not swim here," and we wouldn't. Where he swam we knew it was safe. Fifth and I were both beginning to feel the lack of privacy in these camps. Darcy was anything but an eavesdropper, but it wasn't as simple as his just walking pointedly away from the camp for a couple of hours every now and again so we could have a talk or make love. There was need or excuse for him to do so, and we were so busy with the shooting and doing the hides that all our spare time was spent resting in the sweltering shade under mosquito nets, away from the flies and the sight of croc skins. Fifth and I would have been more alone in a city. It was so hot that even at midnight Brashkovitz lay panting outside our net as though he'd just had a run on a hot day. In this heat it was ridiculous for a man working as hard as Darcy was to go for walks in the afternoon sun during the only time he got rest. So Fifth and I either spoke personal things at night in whispers or not at all. Then one day, when the skins were done, Darcy said he would go on his own that night to the far end of the lagoon we were at, camp there for a few hours, and shoot his way back to our camp before daylight. He wanted to see if the crocs were any different to shoot here at the end of darkness instead of at the beginning. There was no need for me to come, as he was going over water we'd already covered, and he wasn't expecting to get more than half a dozen or so. I was easy to convince. Fifth and I would have a whole afternoon, evening, and night to ourselves. Like hell, Darcy had been gone no more than an hour when two ringers rode up, leading pack horses, and stopped for a yarn and a brew of tea. They came from a station down the coast and were looking for a good yearling cattle beast to kill for beef for the station. "But this is Jack Earp's country," I pointed out. "That's right," they agreed. They hung around talking and asking about crocs and wondering about Fifth being there till four blackfellows came down the river on horses and joined us. They were on their way to the next station looking for a killer too. It was quite a situation. The two ringers from the place down the coast only grinned a bit, and the blacks didn't show any embarrassment whatever. They were just doing what was always done. They camped the night with us and sat round talking till all the handy wood for the fire was burnt. So much for our night on our own. In the morning they drew maps for each other in the dirt with sticks and explained where the best killers on each other's places were likely to be found. Then they rode away to steal beef from each other. Darcy arrived just as they were leaving. He'd been skinning a 16-foot salty that had given him a very exciting time. Fifth and I snarled at each other all day. I told Darcy about the two lots of ringers going off to kill each other's beef. "Yes," he said, "that is right. They never kill their own beef if they can help it. One man kills the other's beef because he knows the other man is killing his. But it is not talked about. The croc shooter kills everybody's beef. They know he is doing it, but as long as he salts all the meat he cannot eat at once and doesn't waste any, that is not talked about either. A croc shooter can save many cattle." We only got 4 salties on that stretch, but plenty of freshies, hundreds of them. When we'd had enough, we easily found a place where the Land Rover could go no further and followed the river back up to the station. We were going on to Managura, and perhaps right over to Borolula on the MacArthur River. We bellied the Land Rover in loose sand and had to winch it backwards out of the riverbed with a Spanish windlass we rigged up with wire, poles, rope, and sweat. Fifth was heartbroken at our rover having to be helped out of a hole, and said it must be getting old, or tired from carrying all our things all that way. I arranged for the so-called timing gear in the transmission case to have slipped again, but I think she was getting a bit suspicious. Then Darcy ruined everything good and properly by asking me to explain how a timing gear in a transmission case worked. Fifth lost faith in me and the Land Rover for days over that. In a cool station homestead during hot cups of tea, we talked about the blacks and their ways. The boss told us how his men would sometimes come and say to him, "We go now, boss," and they'd go walk about. Just like that, regardless of how much work had to be finished or done. Nothing would bribe them to stay once they decided to go walk about. They'd reappear just as suddenly, weeks or months later, as though nothing had interrupted the daily routine of station life. Some of the distances they traveled on foot were incredible. There were often blacks on walkabout staying at the station, and they were usually fed without question till they moved on again. He described the fear of the house girls when they first felt the kerosene fridge, and the antics of 2 of them standing on chairs trying to blow out the electric light when he'd installed a lighting plant a few years before. The stick fights they have where people seldom get hurt, and strange incidents where someone obviously does. We camped that night beside the waterhole that supplied the homestead with water. Half a dozen tame freshwater crocs lay around on rocks and logs, watching us cook steaks for dinner. In the morning we dumped our skins and the dinghy in a spare shed, and then drove all day to Manangura. On the banks of the Fulsh River, there we met an old man who was a genuine philosopher. Old Andy was wonderful to talk to and very funny at times. He got his methylated spirits in 4-gallon drums and drank it with great relish. The labels had skulls and crossbones and said not to be taken, and instructions about what to do if accidentally swallowed. But they put poison dye in that stuff, I told him. Rubbish, he snorted. They wouldn't dare put anything poisonous in methyl. They'd kill off half the Northern Territory if they did that. We bunked down late that night under a lean-to beside his hut, and woke up next morning covered with fleas and dogs and dust. Darcy and Andy were old mates and sat in the shade talking about politics and people, so Fifth and I wandered around having a look at the place and people. Andy was the only white man there, and the blacks lived in a big camp across the river because of having dozens of dogs. They paddled back and forth in dugout canoes, and when Andy wanted someone, he'd go out on the bank and shout at the top of his voice. They never knew who it was he wanted because of the distance and the fact that he could never remember their names, though he knew them well enough. So one of them would get into a canoe and begin to paddle over. Andy would then shout and wave him or her back, and another one would climb into the canoe and begin to paddle over, and so on till they fluked the one Andy wanted. "Fools," he would say, brushing spit from all the shouting into his big white beard. "The native affairs has taken all my good blacks away." Then he would sit in his big chair like a king to await the arrival of the summoned native. The blacks obviously respected old Andy, and took very little notice of this shouting. He ran a few head of cattle, and his requirements were few and simple. "God put me in this blasted place, and it's his job to look after me," said Andy indignantly. But we'd heard rumors that he was very cop-shy about something that happened years before. Winston Churchill was a fossilized black fellow, very good at making spears. He could only misuse a few words of English, but he was a sharp old bloke, and he and I got to understand each other quite well after a while. I stopped to watch him binding 4 wire prongs on the shaft of a fish spear with string that had been waterproofed, with the black wax from the hives of the small stingless sugar bag bees. He never looked up or gave any sign that he knew I was standing there, but when he'd finished, he began making a new spear from a twisted piece of jindy. He heated the bends of the coals of a fire he'd lit to keep the sandflies away. When the shaft was nearly bursting into flames, he took it and patiently worked the bends out of it, again and again, till the 8-foot shaft was as straight as a gun barrel. Then he cut 4 slots for the prongs and fitted and bound the thin end to stop it from splitting, and dug a little hollow in the tip for the woomera to fit in. He produced a woomera with a crock tooth bound neatly to it for a hook, and expressionlessly chopped a few quick and accurate practice shots into floating leaves at the shallow edge of the water. Then, looking at me for the first time, he handed me the spear and woomera to try for myself. In a week I was getting fish with them. The force and accuracy you can get with a good fish spear and woomera up to about 15 yards is astonishing. I traded Winston Churchill a tin of log cabin tobacco for the spear and woomera. He made the exchange as though the price and value had been agreed on from the first. Then he paddled a big canoe, expertly like Darcy, across the river, and came back with 2 long kangaroo spears and a big woomera with carved flat sides. The spears were very light and whippy, with heart-shaped heads cut from a fuel drum. Bound smoothly onto them, without taking any notice of me again, he began to practice throwing the spears at an old sheet of corrugated iron he propped against a pandanus palm. He could plop one of those spears right through the sheet of iron at 60 yards. The velocity was so great and the trajectory so flat that the spearheads cut through the tin without damaging themselves. I was impressed he didn't lob the spear as I'd imagined they did. He held it level at his ear, shook it so it whipped slightly and wasn't drooping, and threw it straight as a dart. One of those coming straight at you would be very hard to dodge or even see. I noticed when I retrieved the spears for him the 3rd time that one of the heads was coming a little loose, so I rummaged in the Land Rover and swapped him Fifth's wristwatch for the 2 spears and woomera before he damaged them, demonstrating, "You can buy 5 quid watches in any town." After a lunch of dugong steaks and camp oven bread baked that morning by Fifth, I saw Winston Churchill walking around, obviously, with 2 long bladed spears with short crooked shafts. I went out to see what this lot was, and he explained, with a few indecipherable words and many graphic actions, that they were stabbing spears for killing cattle. Apparently they run up beside a dozing cattle beast, shove the spear into its ribs, and nip out of the road before it realizes what is happening. The spears often get broken when the beast falls, so not much trouble is taken to find straight handles for them. I showed Winston Churchill my .222 with the scope and told him he could fire a shot through it. He did, right through a bark humpy down on the river bank. Thank God nobody was in it or beyond it. Then he impassively swapped me his 2 cattle-killing spears for my 65 quid rifle. There was an expression on his face when I took it back and exchanged it for a pocket knife with gadgets. His not-too-distant ancestors wouldn't have understood at all, but he can't have borne me a grudge, because he returned later with 2 intricately carved and impressive-looking killing boomerangs. They were about 2 feet 6 inches long and roughly the shape of a flattened giraffe's head and neck. They aren't supposed to return once they are thrown, and if one of them hits you, it would be a long time before you are interested in what happened to it afterwards. I found a cartridge belt, a big silvery brooch, and a brass bangle of fifths to exchange for them. I was fascinated by the balance and workmanship in the paddles they used to steer and paddle their big, rough canoes. Darcy had told me how they often take days to find a suitable piece of wood, and carve a paddle to replace one that's been lost or broken, chipping philosophically away with a knife, using the hard edge of their heel for a chopping block, so the knife won't bite too deeply, till the finished article is smooth and weightless in the hand. They use a lump of wood about 6 feet long and 12 inches through, with a hard, flawless grain. With the same obstinate persistence, they carve their canoes from big paper bark logs and bring them great distances to where they are to be used. A black fellow on walkabout is constantly on the lookout for spear shafts and canoe trees and noting their whereabouts for later use. Darcy once bought a canoe from a black fellow in the Roper for a sack of flour, a few pounds of sugar, and a mosquito net. The black fellow had just brought it 150 miles from up a river round the coast, where he'd spent 10 weeks carving it out of the log. I wasn't ambitious enough to want a canoe, though I would have liked one, but I wanted one of those paddles. So while Winston Churchill and I were in business, I rummaged some more and found a ball of colored string, a 3-cell torch with flat batteries, a cigar, and a combination lock I'd forgotten the combination of. For all this he gave me my pick of 7 paddles. I don't suppose the one I chose belonged to him, but none of the onlookers protested. I suppose he squared it off with the owner later. That night, when Fiff and I were unrolling our swag, we heard the unmistakable, continuous croaking of a didgeridoo just around the corner. We went to have a look, and there was Winston Churchill, sitting against the wall of the hut, with the 6-foot hollow instrument perched on his big toe. He was making the most of this impromptu market day. The instrument was made from a hollow coolibah branch and stained in patterns of tan and white ochre. It looked very effective in the vague light from the hut window. He was droning a steady, simple rhythm, sniffing air in through his nose every now and then without breaking the flow of sound. I'd love to know how he did it. I had a turn and soon got the general idea. Do-diddy, do-diddy, do-diddy-do. We had to have that. Fiff was as keen as I was, so we got a lamp and rummaged again. A pair of Fiff's pants with holes, a red and yellow dress, a pair of thick socks, a sack needle, a cigarette lighter with spare flints, a sheath knife, it was a spare, a handful of marbles, Darcy's croc eyes for stuffers, a pair of sunglasses with one glass missing, and a bag of minties stuck together. Winston Churchill was happy with that, and we were happy with our new didgeridoo. Next morning, a lubra called Popeye looked very trim in Fiff's red and yellow dress. Not so Winston Churchill, who paraded disgustingly around proudly wearing Fiff's woolly old pink pants and the thick pair of socks. We drove nearly 100 miles that day to Burulua over a road deep in pools of bull dust so fine it splashed like water, with the jolting roots of trees in the holes to slow us down. At the MacArthur River crossing we had to wait for 2 hours till the tide went out enough for us to cross. We roared across with water over the bonnet and Fifth squealing with delight. That's where all our films got soaked, and drove round to Burulua on the other side, a couple of miles downstream. We bought warm bottles of beer at the store, talked with people Darcy knew, and took rum and beer to visit Roger up on the hill above the river. Everybody knows old Roger at Burulula. He lives in a square water tank, trades things, wears half a dozen different hats, and calls himself a lotus eater. He's got bad eyesight, long hair, and all the time in the world for interesting discussions. We talked, drank, and ate till the moon went down at midnight. Then Fifth and I spread our swag on the ground, not quite out of earshot, but so we could whisper about Roger or Darcy if we wanted to. They were still talking in rumbly voices over a bottle of overproof rum when we went to sleep. That night someone swam across the river to the native affairs camp, but the dogs drove him back again. By midday of the second day, we'd seen all of Burulula there was to see, and there wasn't much time before the wet was due to start. We drove back to Managura and arrived there in the dark and smothered in dust.